The mouth of the cave was a sliver of gray, a keyhole in the rock that exhaled a breath of damp earth. Old smoke and unspoken terror. Within its suffocating darkness, a dozen women moved like ghosts, their voices reduced to the rustle of whispers and the soft padding of bare feet. For weeks, they had survived on air that tasted of lies and ash. Their senses honed to the ricochet of rumors as much as to the echo of distant gunfire. The whispers had a life of their own, twisting and growing legs in the dark. The Americans will not take prisoners. The words were an incantation, a self-fulfilling prophecy passed from one trembling mouth to the next. They will cut off our hands. They will take the babies first. Fear ran in frantic, repeating circles. An endless loop of dread that trapped them as surely as the rocks that surrounded them. Outside, the indifferent rhythm of the Pacific Ocean kept time with a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Yet, a new sound cut through the chaos. A man's voice, shouting a single command from beyond the ridge. It was neither angry nor excited, just businesslike. And it fell into the cave like a word from a different planet. The student nurse, her tattered blouse hanging loosely on her thin frame, ran a final inventory of what she could carry. A cloth bundle of bandages, a relic of a life she no longer recognized, was pressed to her chest. An older midwife, her shawl wrapped tighter around her shoulders, adjusted the sling on her left arm. The young boy, whose fever she had been watching for days, had finally succumbed to a fitful sleep. They had 2 grenades left, an unspoken insurance policy that felt heavier than their metal weight. A small girl clutched a chipped rice bowl. Each object, each item they held, was a choice. A small piece of their old lives that had been rehearsed and re-rehearsed 100 times in their heads. The plan was clear, grim, and simple. If captured, bite the glass, pull the pin, make yourself heir. Surrender was not an option. Propaganda had taught them that death was the only honorable escape from the monstrous enemy. But when they finally stumbled into the light, blinking against the harsh sun, the first thing they saw was not the glint of a rifle muzzle, but a hand, palm forward, fingers spread. It was a universal signal of peace, of a promise of no harm. The man attached to the hand was young, his face weathered by grime that had whitened the creases at the corners of his eyes. A strip of cloth on his helmet showed 2 letters, a unit mark that meant nothing to them. He spoke Japanese, his words flowing with a measured cadence that made the student nurse blink in disbelief. It was a classroom accent. Too clean, too calm to be the harsh bark of an officer. He told them to come forward slowly, to keep their hands visible, to set down any weapons. He said the wounded would go first. The interpreter's voice was a jarring contradiction to the cacophony of war. They were used to sound as a threat, the snap of a twig, the whistle of a shell, the roar of a flamethrower turning a cave into a furnace. But now, sound arranged itself into a procedure. 2 Marines stepped up with a stretcher. Another knelt with a canteen and tipped a ribbon of water into the little girl's rice bowl, then passed it to the midwife and nodded as if they were sharing a secret. The water tasted of metal, but it also tasted of a promise the women did not yet trust. A corpsman moved in with a canvas satchel, his hands quick and formal. He touched a wrist, counted, lifted an eyelid, and said something to the interpreter. Out came a tag on a string with a space for a name. It was as if these men had brought a small, portable bureaucracy to the mouth of the cave and set it down like a field altar. Shock is an inventory in reverse. For weeks, the women had rehearsed a suicide they called courage. Now, Their bodies simply refused to follow the script. When the corpsman took the student nurse's forearm and dabbed iodine on a shallow cut she had ignored, the sting felt like proof that her arm belonged to the same world as his. He lifted the gauze, wrapped it, and pinned the end with a practiced half-twist. The gesture had the same logic as a bow. The first word that passed between the nurse and the American woman who appeared at the edge of the path was not a word at all. It was a man's jacket draped over her thin shoulders. It smelled of salt and cordite. And it was a promise made without language. The woman wearing the Red Cross armband was pale with fatigue. Her stance, speaking of someone who had been standing for 12 hours and planned to stand for 12 more. She crouched, showed a syringe like an offering, spoke in English to the corpsman, then looked the nurse in the eyes and smiled with one side of her mouth. The contempt she was told would follow her if she lived long enough to see the enemy up close did not come. The monster in the propaganda had a single face. The men and women around her had many. On the far side of the clearing, other caves were exhaling people. Some emerged with hands up, fingers spread, as if surrendering to the sky itself. Others looked back over their shoulders, hoping the mountain would swallow them again. A Marine stood guard with his weapon at a careful height, angled a few degrees low. The difference between aim and readiness. The interpreter's voice glided from one group to the next. Place the children here. We will move you in a moment. Do not run. The instructions arranged them into lines, as if for a festival the island would never again hold. The rumor world of the cave had painted an enemy that was singular, inevitable. But the world outside was full of contradictions. The enemy was a young man trying to look older by setting his jaw, an older man with an expression she could not name because it contained too many things at once, and a Nisei, a Japanese American whose posture tightened when a civilian man emerged holding a bamboo spear. The Nisei spoke rapidly, and the spear clattered to the ground, the moment passing like a shallow wave. The student nurse stared at the Nisei, as if he were a ghost who had wandered out of a story meant to frighten children. He blinked. Not a ghost at all. Just another man working a shift. The danger was still everywhere. A crack from the ridgeline made everyone stiffen. Somewhere offshore, a ship's gun coughed, and the sound walked across the rocks. The American's discipline was not a spell it could break. She knew. But it was a habit they wore like a uniform. As the first line of women was led down the path toward the clearing where trucks waited, one of the Marines counted softly under his breath in English. 1, 2, 3, 4, as if the numbers were a lullaby for himself more than for them. Only later, much later, when dusk had rebranded the world and the first taste of hot broth had stopped shaking on the spoon, did the student nurse open her cloth bundle and take inventory again. She still had the bandage roll, though she no longer knew why she had kept it. She still had her mother's small hair comb wrapped in paper. The grenades were gone. She handed the cloth that had cradled them to the American woman, who used it to wipe a child's face as if it were the most natural exchange in the world. In her lap, the triage tag lay like a name card at a formal dinner. Age, wound, pulse. The data looked like a little poem written in someone else's alphabet. She wondered if this was what the enemy had been all along. Another grammar of order. Another way of putting the broken pieces of a day in a line so they could be counted, and therefore survived. To understand the profound shock of those Japanese women, we must first understand the ground they were standing on, both literally and psychologically. The Battle of Okinawa, which raged from April to June 1945, was not just a military campaign. It was a meat grinder for civilians. While the Allied island-hopping campaign across the Pacific had been brutal, Okinawa was different. It was part of the Japanese home islands, and its people were not a conquered populace but Japanese citizens. The strategic importance of the island as a staging ground for the planned invasion of mainland Japan made the fighting unprecedented in its ferocity. Japanese military commanders, deeply ingrained with the samurai code of Bushido, viewed surrender as a dishonor worse than death. This ideology was extended to the civilian population through a relentless and pervasive propaganda campaign. The Imperial Japanese Army told the Okinawans that American soldiers were subhuman demons Kichikai who would rape, torture, and mutilate them. They were told that capture meant a fate far worse than death. Posters and flyers depicted Americans as monstrous beasts, and the message was reinforced by soldiers who threatened anyone considering surrender. This propaganda was incredibly effective. On Okinawa, entire families committed suicide, often by jumping from cliffs or using grenades, convinced that death was the only escape from a fate of unbearable cruelty. The stories of these mass suicides, particularly at places like the cliffs of Yomitan and Saipan, are a haunting testament to the power of that fear. It's a key part of the narrative that differentiates the Pacific theater from the European one, where civilians often viewed the arrival of Allied forces with hope, not terror. This mass indoctrination was particularly tragic for the conscripted civilians. The women in the cave were not traditional soldiers, yet they were full participants in the war's tragedy. Many were part of the Himeuri Student Corps, an all-female unit of high school students, aged 15 to 19, who had been mobilized to serve in field hospitals carved into the limestone hills. These young women, who had once studied literature, math, and poetry, now found their days filled with the grim realities of triage, wrapping wounds, carrying stretchers slick with blood, and writing down the names of men who would not live to see the next sunrise. No one had prepared them for the concussive force of artillery fire or the smell of burning flesh that permeated the caves. Their teachers, drafted alongside them, tried to maintain some semblance of order. But by June 1945, the caves had become slaughterhouses. When the lines broke, the plan was not surrender, but suicide. And yet, some, like our student nurse and midwife, survived just long enough to be taken prisoner. A similar situation had unfolded a year earlier on the island of Saipan. There, too, women and children fled into caves and ravines, only to be caught between the two warring armies. Rumors about American barbarism swept through their hidden communities, leading many to jump to their deaths from the infamous Suicide Cliff or Banzai Cliff. Yet, on both Saipan and Okinawa, American forces employed a strategy that directly countered this propaganda. They used Nisei, or Japanese-American soldiers, as interpreters to broadcast messages of safe surrender from loudspeakers. These men, many of whom had family in internment camps in the U.S., were the perfect counter-narrative to the Japanese propaganda. They were the enemy, yet they spoke with a calm, familiar voice, offering food and medical care. The sight of these Nisei, the enemy with a Japanese face, was a critical and deeply unsettling first crack in the carefully constructed facade of imperial propaganda. The women's path to captivity was a microcosm of this broader conflict of narratives. The midwife, who clutched her shawl so tightly the guards had to pry her fingers loose to inspect for grenades, had been taught that shame was the only thing awaiting her. The teacher, whose notebook was taken and set aside, had been told her life was over. They had all been told there would be no tomorrow once the Americans came. But a tomorrow did come, and it began not with torture, but with a canteen of water, a medical tag, and a queue for food. This was a new kind of battlefield, not one of gunfire, but of memory and expectation. The women were fighters of a different sort, conscripted by rumor and fear, and taught that surrender was worse than death. Their shock lay not in what they saw American soldiers giving out bread, medics tending to wounds, interpreters speaking calmly, but in what they did not see. No monster emerged from the stories. The absence of the expected horror was, in itself, the most devastating truth of all. After the initial shock of the surrender, the women were guided into a temporary holding area, a space that felt neither like a prison nor a sanctuary. It was night, and the camp was wrapped in a blanket of damp sea air, illuminated by lanterns swinging from ropes. These flickering patches of yellow light cast long, dancing shadows, making the faces of the women look even paler in the glow. They sat close together, knees touching, trying to preserve the last scraps of the cave's closeness and the twisted comfort of its whispered rumors. But the cave was gone. Now, there was only open sky, the smell of kerosene, and the rhythmic crunch of boots belonging to the men who patrolled the perimeter. The first ritual of this new existence was both humiliating and profoundly telling: delousing. The women were lined up, their clothes peeled back as a fine. White powder was puffed into their hair and collars, the sting at their scalps, the grit in their ears. The cough it triggered, all of it felt like a violation. And yet, it was done with the cold, detached efficiency of tagging baggage at a station. An interpreter's voice, as calm as ever, repeated the sergeant's words: "Hold still. It will help against fever." The midwife muttered under her breath that death would have been simpler. But the girl beside her, scratching her scalp, whispered that it felt almost clean. Next came soap. Slivers cut from larger bars were passed down the line on metal trays. The smell was sharp and chemical, but it was unmistakably soap. Buckets of cold water followed, and the women splashed their faces, rubbed at their arms, and wiped away weeks of smoke and blood. For a moment, a startled, awkward laughter rippled through the group when one girl sneezed foam through her nose. No one silenced it. The guards didn't even glance up. The laughter hung in the air, a piece of contraband left out in the open, yet unpunished. Then came the food. Thick slices of bread with crusts too dark, handed out on tin plates. Small, sticky tins of jam, opened with can openers that clattered like tools from another century. And coffee, poured from battered pots into cups that tasted of metal and ash. The bitterness made many grimace, but they drank anyway because it was hot. Hunger and suspicion fought a battle in their stomachs. Some hid half their portions in rags, still unable to believe there would be more tomorrow. But perhaps the most jarring event of the night was the paperwork. A long table was set up under a canvas fly, where a corporal with a pencil sat, flanked by 2 Nisei interpreters, one by one. Each woman was called forward. Name, age, village, occupation. The answers were written down on index cards, clipped to the cardboard tags already hanging from their necks. A photograph was taken with a handheld camera, the flashbulb exploding white against the night. A moment that for many was the first time their likeness had ever been captured in light. Some lowered their eyes in shame, while others stared straight into the lens, as if daring the machine to tell the truth. Fingerprints followed, ink pads, paper sheets, the careful pressing of each finger in turn. The process was alien, almost intimate. "This is for the record," the interpreter explained in flat tones. "It will not harm you." The women looked at each other, bewildered by the sheer bureaucracy of it all. Their lives were being reduced to ink swirls and scribbled cards. Yet the cards were stacked neatly, filed, and guarded. The order itself felt like a language they could not read but could not ignore. As the night deepened, guards distributed blankets, coarse wool, heavy with the smell of oil and canvas, wrapped the women. They formed clusters, heads bent together, sleep coming unevenly. Some whispered prayers. Some cried softly into their shawls, and others sat awake, staring at the silhouettes of the guards, walking their endless circuit. Rifles were slung low. Boots crunched gravel in a rhythm that became a strange sort of lullaby. No one touched them with cruelty. No one mocked. That absence was almost more shocking than violence would have been. The rumors had prepared them for pain, not for procedure. They had imagined chaos, not order. Yet here they were, numbered, tagged, fingerprinted, and astonishingly, still alive. By dawn, the women began to understand the shape of their new captivity. It smelled of soap, tasted of bitter coffee, and sounded like a pencil scratching across a card. It was humiliating. Yes, but it was also coherent. For the first time in weeks, the world around them ran on rules that did not shift with every shell burst. That predictability, alien as it felt, began to chip away at their fear. It was the first fragile sign that the monster they were promised might not be real after all. The next morning, the women were loaded onto a truck for a journey that was as jarring and unsettling as their first contact with the Americans. The road was pitted and slick with rain, and they clung to the wooden rails, their eyes darting between the armed guards and the horizon. But this journey did not end at a prison, as they had expected. Instead, they were driven to a canvas city laid out on a rise above the sea. White tents stood in neat, organized rows, each with the bold red cross painted on its canvas flaps. Visible even from the air, it felt impossible, like stumbling onto a festival ground after weeks of living in caves and fearing fire. They were guided into the largest tent, where the air inside was thick with the scent of antiseptic. The smell alone was a shock. Sharp alcohol, iodine, a clean chemical scent that burned the nose. Rows of cots stretched in both directions, each holding a man or woman, some groaning, others asleep. And that's when the most profound revelation hit them. Americans and Japanese lay side by side, divided only by a canvas aisle. No one had prepared them for this. Enemies, tended to in parallel, their bodies reduced to a single ferry. Universal identity, patient. A nurse approached. But she was not Japanese. Her face was pale, her hair pulled back under a cap, her uniform crisp in a way that looked unreal after months of tattered rags. She carried a tray of syringes, moving with brisk efficiency. When she stopped at the student nurse's cot and tied a band around her arm, the young woman flinched, bracing for pain or humiliation. Instead, she heard the interpreter's calm voice. Plasma to strengthen you. The needle slid in, and a coolness spread up her arm as she watched the clear fluid drip, drop by drop, into her vein. The sensation was frightening, but also strangely soothing. Other procedures followed, equally absurd in their civility. A small piece of shrapnel was removed from a calf. A wound was flushed with clear water that stung with iodine. There was even a dental exam, which felt preposterously civilized. A mirror, a light, and the instruction to open wide. For women who had lived in darkness and dirt, the clinical intimacy of being examined was overwhelming. Shame and relief fought for space in their chests. The midwife, who had clutched her shawl through everything, was astonished when a nurse quietly asked about her pregnancy status. The question was clinical, asked without judgment, and was accompanied by a tin of vitamins pressed into her hand. The idea that an enemy would consider such a detail almost broke her. She swallowed the tablets, their chalky weight on her tongue, feeling like proof of some hidden kindness. They were deloused again, their hair combed through by orderly hands. Wounds were rewrapped in fresh gauze, and each woman received a gown to wear inside the ward. The garments were too big, their sleeves hanging like drapes. But the clean cotton was a revelation. One girl wept silently into her collar, overcome by the simple sensation of cloth that did not smell of smoke. What shocked them most was not just the treatment, but the relentless routine of it all. A bell rang. Trays of food appeared. Broth, bread, even fruit. A medic charted temperatures and pulses on clipboards hung at the foot of each bed. The rhythm of care was impersonal, as if they were part of a system larger than the war itself. And that, more than anything, shook the foundation of the propaganda they had carried. They had been told Americans were savages. Instead, they were being treated as entries in a medical log. They were not cherished, perhaps, but they were also not discarded. The presence of American women magnified this rupture. These nurses were not demons, but professionals. They spoke in firm voices, smiled rarely, and scolded gently when a patient fidgeted. To the Japanese women, their very existence was bewildering. They had been taught that womanhood in war meant sacrifice, silence, and obedience. Here, women commanded orderlies, directed procedures, and carried an authority that was written into their uniforms. It was not kindness alone that astonished, but pure competence. The realization that the enemy's daughters held syringes and stethoscopes with the same certainty that men held rifles lingered long after the lights were dimmed. That night, lying under blankets that smelled faintly of detergent, the women whispered to one another. Some wondered if this was a trick, a way to prolong their suffering before some final cruelty. Others confessed they felt safer here than they had in the caves. None could reconcile the contradiction. In their minds, the war had drawn two worlds apart. Yet here, under a white tent with a bold red cross at its center, the worlds overlapped in the rhythm of a drip chamber, the sting of iodine, and the steady heartbeat of a nurse checking a pulse. The morning after their arrival at the hospital camp, the women faced yet another bizarre and unsettling ritual. A folding table had been set up outside the hospital tent, manned by clerks in khaki shirts. The women were led there in small groups and given a seat on a wooden bench. It felt strangely like school, a return to a life that seemed a world away, only instead of lessons. There were forms, sheets of paper printed with English words, boxes to be filled, and lines to be signed. This was a new kind of battlefield, where pens and ink replaced guns and blood. The first shock came with the ink. A clerk dipped her hand into a small tin of black paste and pressed each finger, one by one, onto a card. The ridges of her fingerprints bloomed in perfect miniature on the paper. The student nurse stared at the pattern, a pattern that was both intimately her own and yet alien in this new context. She realized that in this foreign system, her identity was no longer solely bound to a family register or a temple record, but to the unique whorls of skin at her fingertips. The thought was unsettling, but also carried a strange sense of gravitas. Next came the photograph. A soldier adjusted a tripod camera, its lens glinting in the pale sun. The women were instructed to stand against a blank canvas sheet. The camera clicked, capturing their faces in a single flash of light. For women who had been taught to lower their gaze in a gesture of humility and respect, the demand to look straight into the glass eye was jarring. Their images, once private and unseen, were now fixed forever in an American file. They did not know what would be done with these photographs, but the act itself felt like a strange, bureaucratic form of possession. Then came the questions. An interpreter read slowly from a form: name, age, place of birth, parents' names, marital status, occupation. One woman, a school teacher, hesitated before answering. To admit her profession felt dangerous. An act of self-incrimination, yet the American clerk simply nodded briskly, wrote "teacher," and moved on without a flicker of interest. To the prisoners, this indifference was almost more shocking than outright hostility. Their details were not judged, only collected. Each life was reduced to a line of neat handwriting, stacked in growing piles of manila folders. Medical records followed. Charts were updated with blood pressure, weight, and even dental condition. A nurse carefully noted the fillings and missing teeth of each woman. One prisoner, years later, would recall this moment as the one that struck her hardest. "They were writing us down as if we mattered," she said, as if our teeth were important. She had expected neglect, or worse. Instead, she found herself catalogued like any American recruit. This bureaucracy had a rhythm: fingerprints, photographs, questions, notes, cards stamped with dates. Each woman left the table with an identification tag around her neck stamped with a number. For the first time since their capture, they were no longer anonymous. The irony was sharp. They had lost their names in the chaos of defeat, only to regain them now as entries in a foreign system. Even the smallest details left a lasting impression: the thud of the rubber stamp on paper, the clacking of typewriter keys, the steady scratching of pencils. These sounds became the soundtrack of their new existence, replacing the booms of artillery and the whispers of fear. The story of these women illustrates the profound and often overlooked consequences of propaganda. The Japanese imperial government's relentless campaign against American soldiers created an enemy that was a caricature, a singular, monstrous force. The reality, as those women discovered, was far more complex. The enemy was not a monster, but a system of order, of record-keeping, of procedures that applied to everyone, regardless of nationality. This was a new kind of captivity, one not of physical chains, but of shattered expectations. The women were forced to let go of the simple, clean-cut hatred they had been taught and confront a far more complicated truth. The absence of the monster was its own kind of devastation, leaving them untethered